It's good to see everybody again before the big Exodus takes place this Friday. As we continue on this series of Unwrapping Christmas, I hope today will solidify our assurance and confidence to be able to share the gospel with somebody this Christmas season. We talked about last week how skeptics and non-believers will put up these mental walls when we're trying to present the gospel with them. The first is the idea that Jesus is a myth and not really a real historical person. The second is that the New Testament can't be trusted because it's just a religious book. And the third is that Christianity is just built upon pagan myths. While at the same time, we need to remember Jesus' words to recognize if this person is a person of peace or not, and not to take it personal if they don't receive our message, because it's not that they're rejecting us, but that they're rejecting Him and the Father. Last week, we more than adequately provided 1st and 2nd century non-Christian sources that corroborated the historicity of Jesus. They described Jesus' birth, ministry, and crucifixion, and also the growth of the church that took place after his death. So we shouldn't be troubled from books, articles, or personalities on TV that try to tell us otherwise. Because even when Richard Dawkins says that Jesus existed, then you know that these people are in the smallest percent that deny it. But the biggest event that they didn't describe, but they might have alluded to, was the resurrection, when they said that Christians were believing in a mischievous superstition. All of that has led us to needing to demonstrate the authenticity of the New Testament to the non-believer. So, as we are trying to build a case for the New Testament, we are at the same time building a case for the resurrection. There are typically 7 argued points for the resurrection. The first 4 are for his trial, his crucifixion, his death, and his burial. These 4 are largely accepted as historical facts today in academia. The odd theories about Jesus surviving the crucifixion, him being drugged, or that there was a look-alike imposter on the cross instead are old refuted arguments from over 100 years ago. So what it really comes down to are points 5 through 7. The empty tomb, the resurrection, and all the eyewitness accounts for his appearances that we need to validate. So, is the New Testament reliable? The typical statement that gets made by non-believers about the New Testament is that we all know that the Gospels were written centuries after the crucifixion, filled with contradictions, and that Constantine turned the Roman Empire into a Christian state. Sound pretty familiar? So, what they're really saying is that Christianity in its present form really originated in the 4th century under Constantine and the Roman Empire. So, if you've seen the Da Vinci Code movie, this sounds pretty familiar. If this is what you hear in that moment, first recognize that this is just an assertion and don't take the bait and buy into their narrative. The best thing that you can do is to ask them 2 questions. Where did you hear this? And how do you know that it's true? I almost bet that you won't get a response, but that they'll likely flip it back on you and say, try to prove me wrong then. So, the challenge to us, and rightfully so, is how close chronologically can we get to the cross with undisputed evidence? So, let's address the 1st century claim. There's 2 questions that need to be asked about Constantine. Was he a Christian, and did he turn the whole Roman Empire into a Christian state? A brief overview of Roman history is that they were founded in 753 BC as a kingdom, then became a republic, then eventually became an empire with a Caesar ruling with absolute power. They were unified until 395 when they split it essentially into 2 empires, the Roman in the west and the Byzantine in the east. They were at their greatest strength in the 1st century during the life of Jesus and the apostles. Come the 2nd century, they still had good stability within the Caesar rank, but during the 3rd century, instability runs rapid with insurrection and assassinations, which is why there were 22 emperors in just a 50-year period. Remember, these guys weren't getting voted in like our governor does every 2 years. Which brings us to a very important change in how the Roman Empire was governed in 286. When Diocletian became emperor, he felt the ability for one person to govern the whole empire was impossible at this point. So, he set up what is known as the Tetrarchy, where there's an emperor ruling in the west and in the east, with a Caesar underneath them, kind of like a vice president. So, this form took place up until Constantine became the sole ruler in 324. But after his death, his sons essentially continued this style until the official split in 395 after Theodosius' death. Now, what makes Diocletian so important to this discussion is that he felt that the weakening of the empire was directly associated with the rise of the Christian church. So he initiated in 303 what is known today as the Great Persecution. In that 8-year period, he issued multiple edicts that stripped legal rights from Christians, discharged all Christian military members, forced pagan practices and universal pagan sacrifices upon them. He arrested Christian bishops and priests. He burned down their churches and scripture and confiscated money and property from them. So, if Christians did not adhere to this or renounce their faith, the possible penalties were that they could be arrested, tortured, or even executed. Come 311, Emperor Galerius in the East issued what today is known as the Edict of Toleration. In this edict, he essentially declared two things. Number one, we were just doing it for the good of the Republic. So essentially, he's saying, we're not sorry, we just thought it was the best way to get the Republic back up on its feet. And number two is that it is no longer legal to take possessions away from Christians merely because they're a Christian. The only reason why he really issued this was because the other emperors and Caesars said, enough is enough, this isn't working. So, 2 years later, the famous Edict of Milan was issued by not just Constantine in the west, but also Licinius in the east as part of a pact alliance. What the edict declared was freedom of religion to all citizens and the restitution of property back to Christians. This edict was not a declared state conversion of the empire into a Christian state. This was simply a final act by these two emperors to put to rest the persecution that began 10 years ago. So, if you hear the Edict of Milan was Constantine turning the empire into a Christian state, you now know that there was nothing to this, and that he wasn't the only one involved with the edict as well. After the Great Civil War, Constantine became the sole emperor for 13 years up until his death. In 325, he called for the famous Council of Nicaea. This is the council where we get the Nicene Creed from. The council was called because of a growing tension over the topic of how is Jesus related to the Father? Is Jesus created or eternal? So essentially they're asking, is Jesus God or not? So this is also connected to the debate on what is the Trinity or the Godhead. Now, if you were watching the Da Vinci Code, this is where they really go on a tangent, and sometimes others do as well. They speak as if Constantine was controlling the meetings and forcing upon the idea that Jesus is the eternal God, and just to appease his pagan citizens that were losing out on their old polytheistic ways. The problem with this claim is that there are no recorded minutes that was what was said in the meetings that lasted over a month. The primary sources tell us the results and estimated attendance, but not the actual dialogue that took place in the room. In the end, there were approximately 286 bishops declaring that Jesus is God, and only 2 that refused to sign the creed. Now you might ask, well, what about after Nicaea? Did Constantine turn the empire into a Christian state then? Well, if you look at Constantine's 13 years as sole emperor, here's what we have. We know that he called for the Council of Nicaea in 325, and then in 326 he exiles the Arian leader Eusebius of Nicomedia. The Arians were the ones who wanted to declare that Jesus was not God, so it's not a bad start on his end. But in 329, he reinstates Eusebius of Nicomedia. Then in 330, he builds the Column of Constantine, which is a pagan pillar depicting himself as Apollo, the sun god, at the top. In 325, he exiled Athanasius to Gaul, or Great Britain today. Athanasius was a Nicene who believed that Jesus is God. Then, on his deathbed in 337, he was baptized by Eusebius of Nicomedia. So Constantine was baptized by an Arian who believed that Jesus is not God. So, looking at how he finished off his life, I see the last 4 events as red flags, and strong reasons not to believe that Constantine was a Christian. He built a pagan pillar to himself. I think God told us something about not making any graven images. What's that rule called? Oh yeah, the second commandment. Then, choosing to be baptized by somebody who didn't believe Jesus was God should tell us something as well. You would not get baptized by a Jehovah's Witness and then go call yourself a Baptist afterwards. So, was Constantine a Christian? No. And did he turn the Roman Empire into a Christian state? No. And when you finish off looking at the 4th century Roman rulership, you will see heavy favoritism towards the Arians, and Athanasius was exiled multiple times more by his sons. It's not until 380 where Theodosius I declares that Nicene theology, Jesus is God, as the only legitimate religion in the empire. I know that all of this sounds like a lot of history, but we need to know our history because really this is what the debate is about. Was Jesus real? Did he really rise? And did the apostles and the others see him alive? These are historical questions. They're not philosophical or moral. So it is vital for us to know accurate history. So you or others don't get persuaded to believe that Jesus in Christianity is a myth or that Constantine was the reason for the rise of the church during the 4th century. And I'm not saying that you need to memorize all the emperors or anything, but we should have a good grasp on the events similar to knowing our own nation's big moments like the Revolution, the Civil War, and the World Wars, and so forth. So, if you have just demonstrated that kind of solid knowledge of history to whom you're trying to witness to, I would believe that you have their full attention at this point. So what evidence is available for us to know that the New Testament was written by the apostles in the early 1st century AD? So let's start in the 4th century and see how close we can get to the cross. Out of the 4th century, the primary sources that we have today are known as the Alexandrian Codices. Codices are just manuscript texts in book form, so you can think of these as essentially the Alexandrian books. The main are the Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus Codices, or books. All three have nearly a complete Greek New Testament, and together we can completely reconstruct the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. And the Septuagint was basically the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was done in about 286 BC. Now, in all your time, you might have asked yourself at some point, why are there so many Bible versions out there? The main reason is that as new manuscripts are found, scholars try to analyze the text and translate it into today's language that gives us the most accurate reading. Not all Bible versions are the same in their purpose either. Some are very literal in their translation. They are trying to go as word for word as possible without even sounding too wooden or stiff in the process, while some others want the reader to be able to read it very smoothly and without confusion over the meaning of the passage. So, when these manuscripts were found, scholars started comparing it to the KJV, or the King James Version, and saw that these older manuscripts didn't contain some of the verses that were found in the KJV. Discussing or debating Bible translations can become very heated. Some people present that only the King James is sound and all others are just developed by liberals or apostates that are slowly trying to strip away Jesus' deity nature and pushing in New Age mysticism. The only quick comment that I will make on that is that if you compare the big verses describing Jesus as God, is that the recent versions actually make it even clearer saying that Jesus is God. So, these codices are good evidence for us to demonstrate that the New Testament was already completed prior to the 4th century AD. In the 3rd century, the Chester Beatty Papyri collection stands out, most notably with Papyrus 45, 46, and 47. Papyrus was the material that was primarily used in Egypt along with the Mediterranean. It was made from a water plant and very cheap to produce, but they are extremely fragile. So, if it wasn't for the extreme dry desert climate that they are found in, we probably wouldn't have many of them today. So, looking at the earliest one, P46, are primarily of Paul's epistles. You can see that the first 5.5 chapters of Romans are missing in the chart, along with parts of 6 through 8 missing as well. Then, at the bottom of the chart, you see a couple of chapters from 1 Thessalonians missing, and at the end, the scholars assume that it probably contained the rest of 4 Philemon, 1 and 2 Timothy, and the book of Titus. When you see the word folios at the top for the numbering system, just think of a piece of paper with a couple inches shorter in terms of width. P45 is dated around 250 and likely contained all 4 Gospels and the book of Acts on it. What has been recovered has Matthew's chapters 20 through 21 and 25 through 26, Mark 4 through 9 and 11 through 12, Luke chapters 6 through 7 and 9 through 14, John chapters 4 and 5 and 10 through 11, and Acts chapters 4 through 17. P47 is dated in the 3rd century. It probably contained the entire book of Revelation, but what has been found basically covers chapters 9 through 17. So, as of right now, from these 3 papyruses, we basically have the entire New Testament. All the missing sections tell us is that the sands of time had took a toll on them, but it is remarkable that these have been preserved for us for over 1,700 years. It's one of the ways that we can be assured that God has kept his promise when he said that he would preserve his word forever in Psalms 12. Overlapping the 2nd and 3rd century is the Oxyrhynchus Papyri collection. There are currently over 5,000 documents in this collection that includes various literary genres of writing, along with New Testament books, but most of the collection is made up of public and private documents. The 2nd and 3rd century New Testament papyri from this collection includes 12 New Testament books. 3 of the 4 Gospels are found with Matthew, Luke, and John, and also parts of the book of Acts. From the epistles, we have parts for Romans, Hebrews, 1 Corinthians, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, Philippians, James, and 1 John. Archaeologists believe that this may be only 1 to 2% of what is actually buried in this area. So you can imagine, basically, they probably would find the rest of the New Testament if they were to dig throughout the entire area. In the 2nd century, the Bodmer papyri, or Dishna papers, are the ones that start off first for us. This collection of 22 papyri with the oldest P66 that is dated around 150 to 200 AD. P66 basically contains the entire Gospel of John, and this helps our argument by showing again that the Gospels were written much earlier than what critics assert, and that big Christological passages like John 1:1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," the Word being Jesus, has been there from the beginning. But some liberal scholars like Bart Ehrman try to assert that Jesus' divinity was developed over the centuries. Again, there's numerous reasons that we can show why he is wrong, but this is one of them that shows that the Gospels were not slowly getting massaged over the course of time. Next is the Muratorian fragment, or canon. This list has 23 of the 27 New Testament books today as we see it in the canon. Hebrews, James, and 1 and 2 Peter aren't listed, while the non-canonized books, Apocalypse of Peter and the Wisdom of Solomon, are included. But the thing to note here is that this is just one man's list. But it does tell us about how the New Testament books, as we know them today, were mainly seen as already accepted and inspired works. Sometimes we hear, well, what about the lost books of the Bible and all these types that, like the Apocalypse of Peter, that aren't getting included? The perception here is that Christians were intentionally refusing to enter these books because it didn't align with their own beliefs. The simple reason why these books weren't included is because they weren't written by the apostles and never seen as inspired by any of the early church fathers. The Apocalypse of Peter is not Peter's writing. The author simply put his name on it to make it sound more authoritative. Same with the Gospel of Thomas, Mary, and all the other ones that you hear. The big difference is that the New Testament books that we have were all written by eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, and these other works were all written about 100 years plus afterwards. Next is the Diatessaron, written by Tatian. His goal was to harmonize all the Gospels into one book. A lot of people don't call it a great work, but what it does give us is another example that all four Gospels were already written well before 170 AD. Next, we have the Marcionian Codex in 140 AD. Marcion was a heretic in that he believed that the God of the Old Testament was a tyrant and much different from the God of the New Testament. His codex provides evidence to the New Testament in that he included 10 of 13 Paul's epistles. He didn't include 1st and 2nd Timothy or Titus, and he rejected all four Gospels, but instead he wrote his own Gospel of Marcion that was basically a perversion of the Gospel of Luke. But again, the takeaway here is that the rejection of the Gospels proved that the Gospels were already in existence. And finally, our oldest manuscript to date is the John Rylands manuscript, dated typically around 130 AD. This is also known as P52. This fragment contains a few verses from the chapter 18 of the Gospel of John, where in these verses are the discussion between Jesus and Pilate over who Jesus is. It's just more assurance that the Gospels were written during the lives of the apostles in the early 1st century. As we near the 1st century, it's important to note that we have not even brought up the early church fathers, also known as the apostolic fathers. What makes them so valuable is that some of them were disciples of the apostles themselves. We think of Jesus with his disciples, but remember, he told us to go and make disciples. So the disciples were just following the same script that Jesus taught them. The early church fathers wrote numerous works in the 2nd and 3rd century, but the two that I want to highlight are Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp of Smyrna, as they were disciples of both the Apostle John. If you were to pull their citations of the New Testament books, they basically let us know that all 27 New Testament books were already written prior to them. As we enter the 1st century, we need to make note of another significant event. The 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple is when Rome finally put an end to the rebellion of the Jews in the late 60s. The destruction of the temple sacrificial system altogether, with all the records that were inside, is very significant. The reason why is because they would have had all the records to Jesus' genealogy and could trace to see if his lineage would trace back all the way to David and also from the tribe of Judah. So when you read the Gospels, keep in mind is that the temple stored all the records needed to rebuke false messiahs. But they could do it with Jesus because he was meeting all the requirements. Two more works help us solidify the early authorship date. The first is 1st Clement. This very well could be the Clement that Paul makes note in his epistles. In this work, the writer specifically mentions Paul's martyrdom and might allude to Peter's as well. And he also calls Paul an apostle. And at the end of the book of Acts, we know that Paul is still alive, but he alludes to the belief that he is likely coming to the end of his life. And the other work in the 1st century is the Didache. This work is cited later by church fathers. The first line of the book says, "The teaching of the Lord to the Gentiles, or nations, by the 12 apostles." It's just another important piece that lets us know that the recorded history in the Gospels and Acts are authentic. So, when you lay out the body of work, we see plenty of evidence to show that the Gospels, Acts, epistles, and the book of Revelation were written in the 1st century and not slowly developed over the centuries. Now, people might think, Brett, I see what you're trying to say, but what do the experts actually have to say? Okay. Famed archaeologist William F. Albright stated, "We can already say empathetically that there is no longer any solid reason or basis for dating any book of the New Testament after 80 AD. 2 full generations before the date between 130 and 150, given by the more radical New Testament critics of today." Notice he even said that a 2nd century dating would be radical. So people saying that the Gospels were written in the 4th century would be basically ludicrous. And Bible scholar F.F. Bruce said, "The amount of evidence available to establish a 1st century date for the completion of the New Testament is so great that it cannot be reasonably denied." The key here at the bottom is reasonably denied. You have to blank out and downright avoid the evidence for a late date claim. But I bet the bigger issue on the whole is that the majority of people, Christians or believers and non-believers, haven't really researched what is actually available for us today. So let's see how close we can get to the cross chronologically using the New Testament. Galatians is typically described as the first letter that Paul wrote in approximately 49 AD. He recalls in his past in the letter, "For you have heard about my former way of life in Judaism. I persecuted God's church to an extreme degree and tried to destroy it. But when God was pleased to reveal his Son in me, I did not immediately consult with anyone. I did not go up to Jerusalem to those who had become apostles before me. I instead went to Arabia and came back to Damascus." Paul tells us in Galatians, or tells the Galatians, about how he was the great persecutor of the church, and that after his conversion on the road to Damascus, that he left to Arabia and didn't go to Jerusalem. He most likely skipped Jerusalem out of fear because the Sanhedrin would now think, what happened to our great Pharisee? He continues, "Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas, Peter, and I stayed with him 15 days. But I didn't see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now I am not lying in what I have to write to you. God is my witness. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also." So from these two timepieces, we can see that it was 17 years earlier of Paul's conversion that took place. So the gap between the crucifixion and Paul's conversion was just basically 2 years. So the case for the resurrection is that we already know that the crucifixion is historically reliable, and now that we know that the New Testament is also reliable in itself, is that we can trust Paul's words when he tells the Corinthians in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians that, "Now I want to make clear for you, brothers and sisters, the gospel that I preached to you, that you received and on which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold firmly to the message I preached to you, unless you believe in vain. For I have passed on to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters, no, more than 500, at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as though to one born at the wrong time, he appeared to me also. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am." Now we have internal evidence that the resurrection of Christ historically took place because of the reliability of the New Testament and the eyewitness accounts from the apostles and Paul here also. The non-believer might say, "Yeah, but you still got to take that on faith or believe that they were telling the truth." Now that's true. There's always going to be an element of faith. But as we've seen, the evidence drives us to make the reasonable conclusion that they were telling the truth. Believing in the gospel on faith is no different than jumping out of a plane, doing sky jumping, or skydiving, or jumping off a bridge with a cord attached to your back. You're jumping on faith to make sure that your life is secure. And you're really hoping that parachute opens when you yank the cord as well. But the greatest one that I can honestly think of is when you actually say, "I do" to your spouse. On faith, we made a decision to marry our spouses that was built upon our experiences. We concluded that this person is the right one for us and meant for us for the rest of our lives. Our faith isn't blind like some people like to make it out to be. We've seen over the past 2 weeks that our faith has an abundance of trustworthy evidence to back up the events of the New Testament. So, I hope that we have met our goals and we have the confidence and the boldness to share the gospel with somebody this Christmas season.